Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mabel Hodofia from the Belgian Nuclear Research Center, and my co-chair is
Peter Mihok from Matej Bel University in Slovakia.
Welcome to the last but one session for the day. In this session, we have presentations from our colleagues from Work Package 6. And the first presentation is by Melissa Murik from the University of Antwerp. And she's going to present on refining methodologies, conducting surveys on radon protection attitudes and behaviors in priority areas among residents. So you have the floor, Melissa.
Yeah. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited, but honestly also a bit nervous to present to you today some of the takeaways from what I've been doing in the course of my PhD. And I can already tell you the main focus of what I did was assessing how response biases can be controlled for within surveys. So first, I want to position my presentation within this session of fundamentals. And I do think we've heard a lot, and we have done a lot in our project in terms of new discoveries, and also making sure, hopefully in the future as well, that our discoveries are being implemented into policies. However, it's equally as important that we scrutinize our practices and our data. And I was very fortunate that this is one of the domains that I have been working on within my work package to see whether and how we can improve the reliability and validity of our data so that we make sure that the policies that we design based on this data are not biased, are not ineffective, or even worse, harmful. So, as a first step, I wanted to know what was already done within the field of radon in terms of methodological practice. And of course, with help of many of my work package members, we conducted a systematic review. And some of the main conclusions are found on the slides. So you will have now nice animations. Firstly, we had like 70% of the studies that focused on the attitudes or the behaviors of people. So it was not necessarily social science studies or conducted by social scientists, but they studied these social science contexts. The majority of the times surveys were used, so surveys are very popular in the field. Secondly, the validated constructs were used often. However, people did not validate the instruments themselves, or they did not communicate transparently about them. They usually refer to other studies where some validation has occurred of the instruments themselves. There were very few comparative studies, like 71% was from the United States alone, and we had, I think, 1 or 2 comparative studies. So that was a gap in terms of methodological practices. There was little control for bias, although there was awareness. So people knew that sampling biases and social desirability were a problem, but there were no real methodological studies specifically in this field that we found that dealt with these social science limitations. Then 41% only used a random sample, so often results could not be generalized, and like the majority of the cases were cross-sectional, so we have very little longitudinal data and longitudinal practice. So I knew what I wanted to tackle based on these gaps. I knew I wanted to look into surveys, specifically compare also how instruments work across different countries, and how biases come into play in that regard. So for this, to be able to do this, we developed a radon behavioral atlas, which was like mainly led by one of my co-supervisors, Dr. Tanya Perko. And it was a very extensive effort. We developed an enormous modular questionnaire, and he applied it across many countries. So it's a very rich database, which will be available for use for many scientists in the future as well. So I'm very happy that I got to be part of this aspect of our work package. And within this questionnaire, I specifically focused on people's response behavior. So if you want to understand people's response behavior, a very simplified model is the survey response process model, a very old model. But basically, we sometimes assume that it's easy for people to fill in a survey, but for every single item, they need to comprehend the question and instructions. They need to retrieve information, and hopefully they have some information to recall about this topic. They need to form a judgment, and only then can they respond. And hopefully they do so in a meaningful way. However, there are many interfering factors in this process for every single item. For instance, survey characteristics. If your questions are very ambiguous or difficult, or your questionnaire is very long, it can be very cognitively straining on the respondents. Secondly, there are distractions, social media, and especially a lot of studies are also conducted during COVID, so from a distance, so not the perfect lab conditions, I would say. And then thirdly, you need to hope that your respondents are interested, physically able to read and answer your questions, and also education plays a role in terms of cognitive functioning. So what is known is that a lot of the times people will try to decrease their cognitive burden when filling in surveys, and some strategies to do so are insufficient effort or careless responding. And these are a whole range of behaviors. For instance, they can be inattentive. And within the Radon questionnaire, we had many attention checks, not this one, but we had some, this is an illustration, to capture whether people were attentive throughout the survey. Secondly, also, they could straight line, which means giving indiscriminatory answers, so without regard to the context, content. And if you have positively and negatively worded items, you can also sometimes observe contradictions. And I have to say, it's not a count that we used to see whether people demonstrate this behavior. We had a probabilistic model based on a lot of parameters, which I will not show, but that's how you can capture these behaviors. And secondly, also speeding, so responding in a very, very unrealistic time frame, or dropping out or refusing to respond. So we know that these behaviors occur, and we had many ways of measuring them. But then we also wanted to know, what is the effect of such behavior on our data? Is our data biased? And what can we do about such responding? So I will zoom in into two specific ones. The first is inattention. Here you see just across tab, but there is a lot of differences between countries with how many people actually failed one or two attention checks, and it can go up to 20% of the sample, which is quite significant amounts. And then we looked at whether taking out these respondents matters for your findings. So does it bias your findings? And actually we found little differences, whether you take them out or not. However, when we zoom into these inattentive respondents, we see that they negatively affect the functioning of the scale. They also are more likely to demonstrate other undesirable behaviors, such as being a speeder or straight liner. And also, if you compare just the inattentive versus the attentive, you really see that your models look differently. So that means that this group, although power-wise they may not always be big enough to influence your data, they do respond in a way which is significantly different from your attentive respondents. So it's an important aspect to measure when you conduct surveys. And I showed this cross table, but of course we had like for every step like 7 times 8 for all 8 countries to get into these dimensions. So the second, you can, if you have a substantial amount, potentially use data. So another strategy is to control for certain behaviors on a scale level. And this is an example of a model where we tested it. So to this control, so to explain, we here looked at Belgium in the Flemish and Walloon region. And without controlling for this type of responding, you would assume that Walloon respondents have higher nuclear risk perceptions and also other radiation risk perceptions. Don't mind the name of the concepts. But when you control for stylistic responding, then we see that Walloon respondents are just more likely to systematically agree with every item, and that if you control for this tendency on this scale level, then you would only conclude that they have higher radiation risk perceptions. And it is established in the literature that there are cultural differences in response behavior in terms of what kind of style they prefer. So some people are more likely to AKS, agree with everything, to only choose the middle category and be very moderate, or always choose the extremes. So this is also something very important to consider when you compare groups and data between groups. So as a last step, we are currently doing this. We look at measurement invariance. So actually for every scale that you use, every instrument, it's very nice that you take up instruments from the literature. It's good practice. However, it's also essential that you always test how your item functions for your group, because otherwise you can't actually claim that it's reliable and valid. And this is something we are really doing for all of the radar norm scales. We are comparing all of the countries in terms of how the instrument works for these countries. So we look at, for instance, measurement invariance, then you look at the structure, at the intercept, and at the factor loadings, whether they align. And if they do, you can then you can argue that the instrument measures the same construct in the same way. But if it doesn't, you actually cannot make meaningful conclusions about differences or similarities between groups. And to demonstrate why this is actually really cool that we do this, there are entire European projects who just deal with measurement invariance, but we also assess this as just sub-part within the radar norm project. So it is something really important, and I'm very happy that in the end we will be able to report on how this instrument works in so many countries, and whether you can compare the countries with each other and on what scales, or whether you cannot and must take into account that the instrument may have biased your results as well. So we will test the functional equivalence. And this is kind of a short overview. So I have delved into depth into the survey, and I'm doing still, but we have also diversified all of the methods that are being used in the field, because many of my colleagues have also used different quantitative and qualitative methods. We have developed a valid and reliable instrument and are continuously testing it to ensure that we are reporting on it very transparently. We have a lot of or will even conduct even more comparative studies. We have controlled for this specific bias. We have used representative samples on at least the common demographic characteristic basis. The only thing we did not manage is longitudinal research, and I would say that's still a gap, which maybe in some future projects there needs to be a lot of money for that, but it's also something very important to consider and to do. And so the lessons for my PhD basically are mainly that this type of behavior may skew findings, and we will test how this affects our instruments, and we know that this can lead to incorrect interpretations or ineffective recommendations. And as a takeaway for you, because I really wanted to leave you also with something that you can just implement whenever you conduct a survey. You have like these textbook recommendations. However, I really want to stress the last part of involving social scientists, because I think it's not enough to study the social dimension by merely doing a survey with instruments that you found in the literature. As you see, we know that soil characteristics are very complex and influence how your measurements work. We know that building characteristics are very essential. We know on a cell level that cell characteristics are very important. And I want to argue that on a like psychological level, people are also very, very complex, and that you need to take this complexity into account if you want to produce meaningful and reliable data. So we can help you with that as well. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, for your presentation. Do we have any questions from the audience or online? There's a question. Yeah. Jad, somebody, yeah.
Just one question of interest. How long was your questionnaire? How many pages?
Page-wise, I don't know because it was online, but I think we have 154 items or something. So extensive, but of course we needed to study all of these complex concepts to understand people's behavior. So it's a tremendous effort, I would say. But yeah, I would say generally around, it depends how much of your sample is excluded, but it can be up to 20% sometimes because companies also clean your data often. And I would say it's also important to scrutinize their practices because they differ, which is also something that we found. So even if you outsource your data collection, you need to pay attention to these types of behavior and the practices of the company that you hire to do the work for you. Yeah, time-wise, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. Just a very short speculative question maybe, but here I am. I was just wondering because now, of course, you have done this here for this topic of radon and, well, maybe ionizing radiation more broadly. I was wondering whether you can speculate on whether the chances of the data being skewed, let's say, due to these patterns that you've seen, whether these are maybe higher or lower in relation to the topic such as radon versus other potential social topics.
I would say within the field of radiation protection, there might be a higher chance compared to other fields, just because it's a complex topic. Like there are some topics which we study which are people have more experience with them, and then it's of course easier to answer questions based on such topics. But things like SMRs, radon, or I don't know, all of these other types of radiation are more complex. So also the cognitive burden is higher for people, and hence more chances of this type of responding. I hope that answers it.
Do we have any other questions?
Warren?
Thank you for the interesting talk. Since you have done these surveys in so many different European countries, have you noticed like extremely big differences in the way they respond? And from this, is there something that you can maybe come out in terms of a recommendation to certain countries saying, this is what you should focus on when designing your surveys?
Okay, some of the differences that I already observed are that, for instance, in Ireland, I would expect that they have done so much more regarding radon. So I expected that the survey, that the people would be more attentive, that they would be, responding more reliably. But I think there might be overstudied or over. Like survey fatigue is a thing, and I do think this is a potentially like a reason why people are so inattentive to the survey, because they are already so overburdened with research, which is also something that we need to consider. And then, of course, we know that there are cultural differences in response styles as well. And I would say over the different countries, we also had different companies, and there it was also very interesting that in these different countries, they have different ways of cleaning the data. And I'm most fan of the probabilistic methods, but not every company employs these. So it's also interesting to consider these things which differ across countries and across companies, I would say. Yeah. And yeah, that's a recommendation.
Do we know if we have any questions online?
I don't.
Thank you very much, Melissa, for your presentation once again.
Thank you very much for all your questions. We are ideally keeping in time.